Welcome everybody to this webinar on evolving energy service companies in emerging economies. I'm going to be your moderator for the webinar. My name is Mel Slade and I manage the Energy Efficiency in Emerging Economies programme at the International Energy Agency. And we're very pleased to be hosting this webinar in partnership with our friends and colleagues of the World Bank. Whilst people are entering the room, I'll just say a few words of introduction before we get into the presentations. So we see that the world over, there's not enough progress on energy efficiency. We need to scale up, we need to speed up. But as public budgets are under more and more pressure, inevitably governments look to how to get other sources of finance flowing into energy efficiency so that governments, businesses, citizens can all reap the many benefits of energy efficiency. And energy service companies can play an important role in implementing these energy efficiency projects, which brings us, of course, to today's webinar. We're often asked by the governments of emerging economies how they can go about setting up ESCOs. What's the most successful experience? What models might we look at? And this webinar is part of that conversation. And we're lucky enough to have some of the world's greatest ESCO experience around this table. We have the two giants of China and India who have amazingly successful ESCO models, but they're both very, very different. So why is that? What's made them work? What circumstances do you need to make these different types of ESCO work? Could they work together, those two models? And then we move on to completely different markets of Latin America through our speaker from Mexico. We go to Africa, to our speaker from South Africa, and we also have Alexa Blaza here to talk about experience in emerging Asia too. So from that, by way of introduction, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. We're going to start with a presentation from Selina Lee, who's a policy analyst here at the International Energy Agency, and then we're very, very pleased to have Dr. Ashok Sarkar here, who's a senior energy specialist from the World Bank. So Selina, would you please kick us off? Thank you.
Sure. Can everyone see my screen, please?
Yeah, yes, fine, thank you.
So thank you, Mel, and hello and welcome to everyone joining us from different time zones. I am Selena from the International Energy Agency, working with Mel in Energy Efficiency in Emerging Economies program. So for this webinar today, I'll briefly share our latest findings on energy efficiency financing and ESCO market trends in the emerging economies. So let's start with the macro landscape of the clean energy investment trends in emerging and developing countries. What we observed is that the annual clean energy investments, particularly the energy efficiency and end-use investments in the last 5 years, were almost flat. And although there has been an increase in the share of clean energy investments, which you can see from the yellow dots on the graph, this rise has more to do with the weaker investments in fossil fuels rather than a particular strength in clean energy technology investment. And this persistent stagnation of clean energy investment in emerging and developing countries brings an alarm if we look at where we need to be in the coming decade in order to be on track to reach the net zero emissions by 2050. Our analysis shows that the clean energy investments in emerging and developing countries need to expand by more than 7 times and make over $1 trillion of annual investment in clean energy by 2030. And a large portion of that comes from investment in renewable power and energy efficiency in all end-use sectors from transport to buildings and in industry. So the million-dollar question here is how to finance the investment needed. And here we look at the who, essentially the source of finance for clean energy investment, and the how, using what financial instruments. And compared with the advanced economies, today's energy investment in emerging and developing countries rely heavily on public sources of finance, which reflects the traditional role of state-owned enterprises and governments. There's also a relatively high share of investment done in equity on the balance sheet basis, which reflect the domination of fuel supply investments that tend to be financed with a higher level of equity. But in our climate-driven scenario, we need to shift towards the greater role of private capital and debt finance. Specifically, over 70% of the clean energy financing would need to come from the private sources, which includes private project developers, institutional investors, and commercial banks, especially for renewable and energy efficiency. In parallel, the debt finance becomes more important as energy becomes more capital intensive based on the financing model that are more reliant on the presence of long-term predictable cash flows or energy savings that support project bankability. So while improving the availability of equity is likely to underpin the investments in energy efficiency, meeting the accelerated investment requirements under the IEA climate-driven scenario means increasing the share of debt in energy efficiency financing as implementation of energy efficiency standards and labeling and monitoring and verification protocols helps banks better assess the financial case associated with energy savings. And this accelerated pathway also hinges on the greater role of the third-party developers, such as ESCOs, which start to tap more into the sustainable debt market to help scale up the investment. So there's no question that the role of ESCOs will be increasingly essential in our transition to net zero emissions in the coming decades. What we have observed in our annual ESCO market survey is that the global ESCO market as a whole remained resilient in 2020 and increased by around 6% to $33 billion. But this growth really comes from China, where the estimated investment spending rose about 12% despite the pandemic. But outside China, the impacts of the pandemic varied. While the business has remained stable in early 2020, thanks to the contracts and arrangements agreed in earlier years, they become increasingly disrupted and restricted, but mainly due to the physical lockdowns. And many countries, especially the emerging developing countries, pointed to staff cuts as a key challenge, and the difficulty of interacting with the existing and new customers for business developments was also flagged in the survey. But then there are some countries who pointed to the possible opportunities that could be seized out of the pandemic. For instance, the countries from the Middle East region, such as the United Arab Emirates, reported that the increase in the awareness for efficient ventilation and cooling and their benefits for indoor comfort and health helped with the new business development, and that the support from the super ESCOs was instrumental. And in fact, UAE is another country that is estimated to have made a small growth in 2020. Chinese ESCO Association, EMCA, reported that the ESCOs in China quickly turned to using the online tools and remote controls to keep the client engagement and business operation as alive as possible. What is more, China took this as an opportunity to innovate their business models and enhance the capacity to apply smart tools and technologies such as digital data computing and artificial intelligence more broadly in their business development and operation. And of course, behind that is the multiple support from the Chinese government, which we can hear more from our panel speaker, Lily, in the following panel discussion. So in overall, our analysis shows that while the pandemic has put a dent on many ESCO industries around the world, particularly in emerging and developing countries, it's less that the pandemic has created new problems for ESCOs, but rather that the crisis has further exacerbated the existing structural problems that held many ESCOs back. And this graph here captures some of the key challenges and barriers that were highlighted in our survey. The lack of trust issue stands out for both project development and financing. And while this term lack of trust could sound ambiguous, it mainly speaks to the low level of public awareness and understanding, and hence the low confidence in investing in energy efficiency projects and financing in overall. The issues related to the ownership and commercial arrangements, such as the lack of transferability, split incentives, as well as the technical aspects related to cost and accounting, also figured prominently among the challenges. And here, both the governments and financiers have a critical role in addressing these cross-cutting issues. The Development Finance Institutes, for one, has helped support the developments in China and other emerging and developing countries, as well as the dedicated funds and risk-sharing facilities. Thailand's Energy Efficiency Revolving Fund is one of the good examples that has helped improve access to finance and stimulated commercial bank lending. We also found that the use of smart digital tools could also stimulate investment. Smart sensors and big data enable more transparent and systematic monitoring, reporting, and verification of energy savings, thereby enhancing trust among the counterparties. They can also support the scale-up of innovative business models such as cooling as a service, which is happening in Argentina and India. But what we need first and foremost is clear targets with concrete policy actions. And here is one indicator to show how that is largely lacking in the region. We have tracked the sustainable energy targets indicated in our focus emerging and developing countries NDCs and found that only 40% of them have put in place targets to improve energy efficiency. And if we investigate into how many of these targets are actually backed up with concrete policy measures, it becomes even more worrying. And this is a huge opportunity missed because energy efficiency holds the largest potential to reduce carbon emissions. The implementation of all cost-effective energy efficiency policies and readily available technologies today could deliver 2/5 of emissions reductions we need to meet the Paris Agreement. So the governments in emerging and developing countries can seize this potential by starting with setting up clear targets accompanied by concrete plans and measures to attract enough investment. A good case in point is India, where the energy conservation building code rollout is progressively becoming mandatory in states across the country. And since the last revision of the building code in 2017, investment in buildings efficiency has more than doubled, creating more business opportunities for ESCOs and helping with the employment. Similarly, our comparative analysis shows that putting in place green building certification scheme can facilitate bankable projects as well as refinancing in emerging and developing countries. And all these examples point to the importance of strength of policy and regulatory frameworks. And now would be a critical time for the governments to intervene and help revert the downswings that many ESCOs in the emerging and developing countries faced in 2020. And this final message brings me to the end of my presentation today. I understand that it was a very broad overview given the limited time, but I hope it helps set the stage for the panel discussion. Should you have any questions or suggestions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Selina. Really important to see how the investment figures are going, what our targets are, and what big challenge we have. And with that, we'll go on to our shock, please. Could you, the floor is yours for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Mel. First, let me do a mic check. Can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Everything's good, thank you. Could you put your presentation into, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mel, and thank you to the IEA for organizing this important webinar. Thanks to Selena and all the other colleagues, and of course, all the panelists, esteemed panelists who have joined today in spite of their busy schedule. So I'm going to really take a few minutes to describe what Selena has very rightly put forward as the challenges at the macro level and how they boil down to the micro project level, and why are we not seeing many of these ESCO projects happening, even though ESCOs have been around, have been talked about for almost 4 or 5 decades now. And many of us have been, I guess, discussing the same kind of questions over and over. Some solutions are emerging, and I think we're going to hear about some of them in the panel. And therefore, the idea is to see what are the success factors of this ESCO projects. So I think I always start with this big picture, saying that there is a fundamental difference between our sector and the other traditional conventional energy sectors. Demand side energy efficiency measures tend to be small and dispersed. They deal with multiple stakeholders. And unfortunately, unlike the supply side options, there is not a single solution for each of these demand side options. And therefore, it results in high transaction costs. And this heterogeneity of the market makes it even more complex ecosystem for energy efficiency, particularly on the demand side. And ultimately, what we are also talking about is a revenue based on savings. And savings is still considered virtual by many of the financing institutions who are ultimately the final downstream important stakeholder who have to close the loop. And unlike many of the revenue generating projects, energy efficiency tends to give this connotation of have a negative revenue. And therefore, that causes a lot of risk perception amongst the financiers. Now, having said that, even if these are small projects available in pennies and dimes lying on the street and not necessarily $100 bills, there are ways which our colleagues from all over the world, stakeholders, market players, policymakers have found solutions to be able to address some of these barriers. Now, the point still remains is that because there are multiple barriers in multiple sectors, the solutions in terms of how to address them lies within the landscape of policies and regulations, institutional frameworks, technical capacity, information awareness, and finance. And unless you have all these 5 pillars of energy efficiency progress, as we have seen in some of the OECD countries, you really don't see the shift in energy intensities in overall context. You would have pilot project successes here and there, but you really need to have all these 5 pillars in place in countries to have a real progress in terms of the progress which we are looking for under the 2050 scenarios. IEA has done a wonderful report last month on the transition to 2050 and how it can be zero energy. And much of that can be achieved through energy efficiency, provided we have all the 5 pillars in place. Just by doing financing, again, doesn't solve it. ESCOs alone cannot solve the problem. You need policies, you need information, you need awareness, you need capacity. Now, when it comes to financing, where the World Bank is quite involved, it is the way to look at it is what we look at the financing ladder. As you know, in a ladder, it's very difficult to go to the top rung without stepping through the lower steps of the ladder. And in most countries, what has happened is we have also tried to do ESCO development, which is really one of the highest options first, without going through the basics. Now, the basics would be utility demand side management, public super ESCOs, credit lines, commercial banks, programs, energy efficiency funds, and then ESCOs, which is really a very private sector commercially driven solutions, should be looked at. In many situations, people have thought that ESCOs is the panacea. Let's try to do ESCOs everywhere. But it doesn't work unless you have the right environment. Right environment means the right maturity of the financial market, the right kind of standardized templates which are required for ESCO transactions. And those need to be put in place before you actually think about a really thriving ESCO industry like you see in the United States or in Germany or in Australia and many other parts of the world. The other aspect of this financing ladder is that we cannot solve the energy efficiency or the ESCO problem just with public finance. Public finance is really the trigger. Ultimately, it's the unlocking of the private sector capital, which is absolutely a must to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, which we talk about. Now, we have heard that from Selena and others that the actual amount of financing in energy efficiency remains quite small, $35 billion through ESCOs in roughly a $150 to $200 billion market of energy efficiency, which has a potential of $1 trillion. Now, that $1 trillion, the difference can only come from private sector because public sector has a limit. Development banks have a limit. Climate finance has a limit. But it's a private sector where the money is there. There's a lot of liquidity in many of the countries we are talking about who are on the panel today. And how do you unlock that private sector capital is where I would say the solution of ESCOs and super ESCOs and funds come in. And again, we don't need to go with the ESCO models, but essentially there are fundamental barriers and systemic barriers, particularly in the public sector projects where there's a lot of potential. So when you talk about public buildings, street lighting, water pumping, these are big opportunities. Private sector through globalization is doing a lot of energy efficiency work on their own, but the public sector needs help. But that's where the ESCOs perceive the maximum barrier. And some of the barriers are listed here. I'm not going to go over the detail because of paucity of time. But how do you overcome some of these barriers? if ESCOs don't work, if financial institutions are not lending to ESCOs because they perceive these barriers, or the end user does not want to work with ESCOs, if they perceive some of those barriers, the super ESCO model has emerged as one of the alternatives. Again, not the single solution which fits all, but it fits in many countries. We have seen this kind of concept, even though it may not be called a super ESCO, but a super ESCO type of operation in Armenia, in Belgium, in the Middle East, in Etihad, and I know our colleague who is connected from ADES, which is in Abu Dhabi, is also involved in a super ESCO operation. We have worked with our colleagues in Saudi Arabia, setting up Tarshid, which is another super ESCO, and we'll hear from another very, very successful super ESCO from India when Saurabh Kumar, our colleague, talks about it. Now, again, this is one solution. On the ladder, there are several solutions. And the super ESCO's idea is to really help, again, unlock the capital, bring in the private sector ESCOs, and make it a market-driven energy efficiency market transformation. One last slide to show that in the midst of all this, all of us know that our sector is going through a huge transformation. You can call it disruption. I call it the 5Ds, the 5 mega trends: disruption, decarbonization, decentralization, democratization, and digitalization. All these trends have really changed the landscape of ESCO transactions. So ESCOs are no more thinking about energy efficiency on the demand side. They're combining rooftop solar. They're combining energy storage. They're combining electric vehicles. They're combining consumers who are becoming prosumers to generate electricity on their rooftops and sell back to the utility. So the ESCO business model has gone through a tremendous transformation, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, because of this disruption going on and the decentralization going on in the world, all over the world, particularly in the energy markets. And this is where I think the direction is, and ESCOs, in my opinion, in our experience, need to think beyond energy efficiency. And I think we're going to hear about it a little bit from our colleagues, how many of these ESCOs are actually indeed doing that. And it's not just solar, but it's also electric vehicles and digitalization methods, consumer producing rooftop solar generation, storing it in energy storage, batteries owned by consumers, owned by utilities, owned by ESCOs. So there are various kinds of innovations which are going to emerge, as we'll see over the next decade or so, if we were to achieve the 2050 net zero target. I think I have exceeded my time. I'm not going to go into much more of detail, but of course, I'm looking forward to hearing from our esteemed panelists. Just the last slide to summarize what I think: policy and ecosystem support is absolutely necessary, fundamental when it comes to ESCO development. We have seen countries where ESCOs have developed with a lot of incentives. Example being China, example being the United States, example being Germany, where initial trigger came from the policy and the financing support sometimes by the government. Then it comes to standardization. You cannot have each ESCO develop its own ESPC document. You have to standardize them. And finally, you have to have ESCOs think about borrowing and doing themselves, not acting as consultants. As we say, shared savings is the model to go ahead. That's where the ESCO takes the financing risk and the implementation risk, and just not the implementation risk and acts as a consultant and calls themselves ESCOs. So I think the true full service ESCO is which does financing and implementation together. And that's what we call the shared savings model. And the world has to move in that direction, and beyond energy efficiency, combining solar, EVs, and other areas. Fine, that's my last slide. Thank you very much for the opportunity once again. I really am looking forward to hearing from our colleagues from the various countries about their practical experiences, and also the Q&A session at the end of the day today. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Ashok. Thank you very much for that, whistle-stop tour of the pros and cons and the best practice in terms of developing ESCOs. Could I ask all our panelists to turn their cameras on, please, now? So we're going to go to a panel which comprises Lily Zhao, who's the Executive Vice President of the Energy and Environmental Service Industry Alliance in China, Saurabh Kumar, who's the Executive Vice Chairman of India's Energy Efficiency Services Limited Group, Barry Bredenkamp, who's General Manager of Energy Efficiency at the South African National Energy Development Institute, SANEDI, Mr. Paul Ortega, the Mexican Association of Energy Efficiency Companies, and Mr. Alexander Ablaza, who's the founding convener and co-chair of the Asia Pacific ESCO Industry Alliance. Like I say, some of the world's greatest ESCO experience all around one table. So we're very privileged to be having this conversation. And I'm going to start with a question to each of our panelists, and maybe you could take 2 or 3 minutes to answer this and use it to serve as an introduction too. And I'm going to start with Lily. So Lily, when the Chinese ESCO journey started in the mid-90s, when the World Bank got together with the Chinese government and said, okay, how can we get ESCOs to try and solve the energy efficiency problems that China had in that day? There was an extremely thoughtful process of what the barriers were, what needed doing, what regulations were required. You know, it was a very, very well thought out and long-term process. And there's been a transition from that to a more modern market-based system. Would you just spend a few minutes describing that journey, please, and what you think the key lessons are from the perspective of others who might want to start? So, you know, how can they leapfrog? How can they use that China experience to get a head start?
Yeah, I think that everybody knows that China has I can say the best policies, national policies to promote the ESCO industries. But yeah, I have to say there are two sides of policies. At the very beginning, we do need the support from the government to create the market for ESCOs. As Mel mentioned, that about maybe 20 years ago, when energy efficiency is not so, you know, aware by the public, especially by the industries. So ESCO was regarded as a very useful tool to promote the energy efficiency for the energy users. And at that time, a lot of studies of research have been done by the research institutes supported by the World Bank and of course supported by the Chinese government. And about 10 or 15 years ago, Chinese government put forward a series of national policies to support the ESCO industries, including the direct investment, direct subsidized, and also incentives for the tax preference policies, and also some other regulations to overcome the barriers for the public sectors as well. I have to say that these policies really played a very, very important role to support and promote the fast increasement of ESCO industry at that time. And, you know, at the very beginning, only about hundreds of ESCOs in China, but suddenly, you know, there are almost 5,000 ESCOs just established within 5 years. I cannot guarantee that each ESCO achieved their success by using the policies. Some of them are still working very hard, and some has you know stepped out of this energy efficiency market. But we have to admit that the policy really you know helped to create the market at the very beginning by put forward this new concept to the public and put forward the direct support to the ESCOs, and which helped to raise the awareness of the publics and the users, especially the investors, especially the financial institutions, especially the banks. And I think this is the key role of the policy. But later on, you know, there were some problems happened. You know, some of the ESCOs trying to rely on the policies, or they're trying to make benefits, or they're trying to keep their profit, keep their project to be profitable by the government support, which is impossible for long terms. So I think after 5 years, the central government just changed the policy from the direct investment, from the direct subsidies to more moderate policies, and a lot of regulations were put forward to regulate the market, which is, I think, provide you know, indirect support, a kind of protect for the ESCO industries. And you know, the some national standards, some regulations, and some guidelines were put forward to the ESCOs, to the end users, and also to the financial institutions. I think as this period of time, you know, is quite a hard time for most of the ESCOs. They have to change from the high profit of the ESCO projects to more, how to say, you know, the low-hanging fruit not everywhere. So they have to find properly the project, select the project, and they have to calculate their profits and investment very carefully. And but I think this is really quite good for the sustainable development of ESCO industries. And you know, ESCOs cannot live on the policies for long term. They have to grow up. They have to get mature in the market by themselves. So I think after 10 years of experience, the policy, they just step backward, and the ESCO market are totally, goes to the market. I think this is what I called it, from mayor to market. The government or the policy is not so strong, but the market has been there, especially the industries, the buildings, and some public sectors even open for the ESCOs, which is very good. So as long as the market is there and people realize that they can make profits by using the ESCO business models, a lot of investors from the market are getting in. This is good, and I think this is really important. This is critical and key for the success of China ESCOs, especially for the sustainable development of Chinese ESCOs. So I think just in summary, the role of the government and the policy should be supportive at the very beginning, but in the middle, probably they have to regulate market by putting forward some regulations and standards, and also some kind of list. The central government and the local government put forward a kind of ESCO list, which is qualified well enough, and also they have we call the blacklist. Those kind of ESCOs with bad experience or bad qualities are also announced to the public. And I think in end or finally, the ESCO has to go to the market by itself with the support of the financial institutions, with the awareness of the end users and support from the market. Yeah.
Thanks, Lily. Thanks for a whistle-stop tour through 25 years. Just to say, I was smiling because something you said at the end there, I remember talking to Bob Taylor from the World Bank, who was one of the big forces behind the World Bank and China Energy Conservation Program, which started this ESCO project. I remember him saying back in 1996 that we have to devise a way for people to make money, businesses to make money out of energy efficiency, and then it will fly. And you've just said exactly the same thing. So thank you for that. We're now going to move on to the next giant of the ESCO world, and hear from Sarab Kumar from Energy Efficiency Services Limited. So Sarab, you started out with a completely different model. Can you tell me where the idea came from and how it evolved?
First of all, thanks, Mel, IEA, World Bank. So I'll make 2-3 points, because I've been in this industry for over 1.5 decades, and if you really ask me why the ESCO model, and I'm saying in India, and which holds true for many emerging economies, failed, was beautifully captured by IEA in a report that it did about 10 years ago, where it called energy efficiency as an elusive asset, which is absolutely correct. If you describe that, because you can't measure energy efficiency. There's no instrumentation that can help you finalize energy efficiency. So our own experience, when I was in the Bureau of Energy Efficiency about 12 years ago, I pushed a lot to create a kind of a amenable ecosystem for ESCOs by creating a performance contract, etc., getting financing platforms done, getting debt done. We worked with Ashok in the World Bank to get a line of credit for ESCOs through SIDBI. Nothing really worked. So when I came on the other side in Energy Efficiency Services Limited, I realized what are the 2 critical challenges which have been really at the bane of any ESCO market development, particularly in India. And I'm sure, I'm not taking the examples of developed world. There are 2 critical issues. One is the availability of data. And even if the data is available, how good that data is. So that's number 1. Number 2, you give as much of debt financing to ESCOs. The fact remains there is no equity that these ESCOs have. And by definition, ESCOs are a service company, and therefore they are limited by the fact that they have very limited equity. And the third issue that I will mention here is the monitoring and verification protocols. Now, if you look at the emerging and developed economies, if you have very intricate, very detailed monitoring and verification protocols, which in terms of, as Lily just said, if you want people to make money, if your incomes and your revenues are contingent upon detailed M&E protocols, I'm afraid A, no private sector is going to enter. B, no financial institution is going to lend you. So what would we do differently to scale up? And unfortunately, if you look at the Indian ESCO market, and I'm just looking at industry and host of other things, the annual market for energy efficiency investments in industrial sector plus outside of it is about $4 billion. Largely 3 billion, 3.5, almost 3 billion is done by the industry themselves, which is they're doing it under the regulatory framework that the Ministry of Power has done. And out of the 1 billion that ESCOs need to do, we do almost 80% of that. So what is the differentiator? A, we have equity, and it's not about private or public. We have equity. That's number one. Number two, what we have done differently from many other experiences in the world, including China, is that we have created, that elusiveness of energy efficiency, which depends upon M&V, we have created into an annuity model, very much like what Ashok showed in his first or second slide, that you have investments coming up in renewable energy infrastructure, but not enough in the energy. So what we have done, what we call is demonstrated and deemed savings approach. So take a case of a street light, the simplest ESCO project that one can do. What we did was we took a stretch of road, and normally on a road there's on the median there are two lights that are hanging. We let the first light remain as it is, change the other one to LEDs over a period of, let's say, 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers. We told the municipal corporation, please study the energy reductions. Please ask any external agency to study what is the benefit that you are getting. I'm offering you 50% of energy reduction. That's it. You may get more than that, and I'm happy that you can keep it. Once you are convinced that you have a minimum of 50% energy reduction, thereafter my payments are not linked to M&V. And that's how we were able to scale up. We changed the energy efficiency traditional model into an annuity model. So moving forward, the lesson that I could provide to anybody who wants to scale up is that it is very difficult to build capacity of a host of stakeholders, from policymakers to financial institutions to technology providers and so on and so forth. Therefore, have a deemed and demonstrated savings approach. Once you demonstrate, thereafter, follow what China has done, a deemed savings approach. It becomes a normal annuity. Banks understand this very well. But to do that, we need equity. Debt financing is not an issue. And one last point, since we have all the best brains of energy efficiency in the world, and as Selena very rightly said, and IEA has been talking about it, 55% in our 450 ppm scenario, 1.5 degrees centigrade, 55% of emission reductions have to come from energy efficiency. We have two intergovernmental international agencies for renewable energy, where you really don't need, if you really ask me, any international support. There is none for energy efficiency. In this August house, I would, with two stalwarts of energy efficiency in IEA, Mel there, Ashok Sarkar in World Bank, I think it is high time that we need to raise the bar at the international level, create an intergovernmental body for energy efficiency, and start sharing, not just, virtually all what Ashok said, I completely agree. You need best practices, you need standardized models, you need what has worked in which country, and it has to be done as of yesterday. So these are, if you ask me, in a nutshell, my experiences, our experiences in India. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Did I mean, that model evolved for the public-private partnership of ESL. I mean, did it surprise you how well that procurement process model kicked off, or were you sure when you kind of came up with the idea that this was exactly the right thing for India?
Well, Mel,
how confident were you?
So let me say that it's not just right for India, and Ashok mentioned about Tarshid, a super ESCO in Saudi Arabia, and thanks to Ashok and World Bank, they were not going anywhere. And they up and until they took us as a consultant. Now I'm happy to report they have changed all their streetlights in Riyadh, and they have asked us to do a similar model in. So it was very clear there is enough of financing available. There is enough of a need to do at the policymakers level. You had to create very simple instruments which are understandable to all stakeholders. And once you do that, scaling up really is not a big issue, is not a big challenge. But yes, let me reiterate. And again, IEA is here, World Bank is here, particularly World Bank and other MDBs. They provide a lot of line of credit. I think it's high time that these MDBs should also look at some sort of an equity fund to really seed. There are 115 or 120 ESCOs, which Ashok knows very well, which are there in India. If you look at their ESCO activity, it's next to nothing because these people don't have equity. You have startup funds. So this is really, if you ask me, these 2-3 simple issues can really change and catalyze the market.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Insightful as always. So now we're going to go to Barry Bradenkamp from South Africa. So listening to that experience, Barry, what do you take from that from South Africa? What do you think you can take from those two models to make the ESCO market develop harder, faster, be more successful in the South African context?
Yeah, thank you, Mel, and good afternoon, everyone, and greetings from South Africa. Just before we started, we said this is like a reunion. I really feel proud to be part of this panel with some people that I've seen many years ago and some people I see quite regularly. So it's been very interesting so far, and we've been following, the developments in Saudi Arabia and in India, which have got phenomenal results, and they've been shared with us, but also with some of the points made by Selina in the overview and Ashok as well, who we're working closely with to try and get the South African ESCO market really becoming a robust market. So the market has been in South Africa has seen different levels of maturity. So depending on where the money goes, so the ESCO market fluctuates. But in essence, what I'm hearing, we've got the 3 main parties here, and that is your client, your ESCO, and government. Yes, you have the financial institutions and all the supporting mechanisms, but we as SANEDI are the South African National Energy Development Institute, and we're an agency of government, so a sort of an energy agency, but we have other portfolios in research and so on. And what we're finding, or what we're hearing from the ESCOs in an emerging market type scenario, is that they would like government to do a lot more than we see and we've heard now. But you've got to find a balance. This is not a regulated market. So the types of things that we're learning from the colleagues and that we're trying to implement, and with support of many others, we've had support from GIZ in this program, and we're doing a program now in the near future with support from the World Bank, is the things that are lacking to create and establish this market is things around capacity building. In South Africa, we have a growing market, very high unemployment levels of youth, people that are eager to learn. We need to give them the right training. They've been trained in certain disciplines, whether it be engineering, whether it be in plumbing, whether it be in mechanical engineering and so on. But it doesn't sort of reach a point where it all brings everything together. So capacity building around energy markets and energy services is the one gap, and that's where we see we can and should be playing a role. Awareness raising, that we see as one of the biggest gaps. It costs a lot of money, but we have to create a market, and we can only do that through creating awareness. So the aim is to do a lot more. We're starting with that. We're trying to profile projects. We're trying to profile individuals. We're trying to profile ESCOs. We're producing directories of ESCOs, and the awareness part is something that we want to focus on. So that is sort of a pull strategy to create the market. What we're finding lacking, and what we've also now just seen from the previous presentations, is the providing of information and advisory services. You know, a lot of people have got a need in terms of what they want to do and achieve in terms of energy efficiency. They would approach us as an agency. Who do you go to? So we've created an ESCO register in South Africa. It's not a accreditation system, but we go out on an annual call and we get potential ESCOs to approach us. We go through a full supply chain management process, and we create this register, which is an online register. But because you need different levels of ESCO, so not everyone can be everything to everyone, or go into an industrial facility and do a full energy retrofit. That type of skill is completely different to the person who might just be doing a couple of small buildings, for example. So we've got a 3-tier system where the register looks at tier 1, which is basically your very large, some of them multinational. They work across all the countries we are represented today. And they can go into any plant, any facility. They also don't need support in terms of capacity building or awareness raising. They've got big budgets. They can do this stuff. They've got access to finance. They've got strong balance sheets. Then you have the tier 2 ESCOs, which are your sort of middle of the road. These are the guys that can go into pretty much building small industry and do provide the services. They can approach banks and financial institutions for funding. They have got a bit of security that can help them. And that's sort of the main body of the ESCOs. But then in a developing country like South Africa, or in an emerging economy like South Africa, we have to cater for the smaller ESCOs. And these are our tier 3 ESCOs, where these are really people just starting that need to be nurtured. They need to get access to markets. And that is where we're putting a lot of focus on as a government agency to help and capacitate them and to get them into the market so that this market can grow and develop. We've tried things like matchmaking, tier 1 ESCOs with tier 3. Doesn't really work. People feel that they're losing their competitive edge by training the younger generation to take over from them at some time. So those are sort of barriers that we have seen that occur. But the focus is to bring the smaller guys in, and really they're open to new technologies, they're open to new ways of doing things, and they're eager to learn. And that's where our focus is and what we hope to learn from our colleagues and going forward. I think the last thing that I see as a role that we do play, and which is sort of pretty much what we're doing here today, is that as an agency, we need to play the matchmaker role between the customers and ESCOs. It is a bit risky because you could be sending a client onto, or putting them in touch, or matchmaking them with an ESCO, and they might have a bad experience and it comes back to bite you. But broadly speaking, we get lots of inquiries. People say, my energy bill's too high. I need to do something. I want a solution. We are in a position then to refer them to the register and try bring the parties together. So that's sort of the softer issue. And then obviously there's the real hardcore stuff like technology training and development around specific interventions that are necessary, because we've got a broad market and not everyone can be an expert in motors, pumps, lighting, HVAC, and all the other technologies. So that also needs to be segmented and a process followed in terms of slowly capacitating these people to get into the market. So that's sort of the learnings that I'm hearing and that are gaps in the South African market that we hope to address in the near future, because this is one of our priority areas going forward.
Thank you, Barry. And thank you for the emphasis on capacity building, because of course that's something that is tremendously important. And if we look back to the China experience, for example, the investment that the World Bank put into capacity building there was absolutely massive. You know, there was a huge amount of work that went on there. So, you know, that was well recognized in those days. Now we're going to move on to another region and ask Paul from the Mexican Energy Efficiency ESCO Association to tell us a bit about experience there. And maybe, Paul, you could, we've had a couple of comments, both from India and both from Ashok, saying this is the market for energy efficiency, this is the part of it that's accessible to ESCOs. Could you tell us a bit about you know, what the size of the energy efficiency market in Mexico and the size of the ESCO market too, and how much ESCOs are accessing? Thank you.
Hi, good evening or morning to everybody, and thank you for inviting us. I'm really pleased to be here, and hope that I can provide some insight about Mexico. I believe that Mexico is currently going through an interesting transition. We are a country that's fairly large, maybe 1.6% of the total population, and we're next to one of the biggest markets in the world, which is the United States. And I believe that somehow this has created the opportunity, but at the same time, the barrier to increase the ESCO markets in our country. To some extent, the ESCO market in Mexico has never really detonated. And in some other countries, the ESCO was largely developed by the government incentives, but also by the market created by the same institutions that require energy efficiency in the government. So ESCO projects in the United States, in Japan, in Europe, started to become very common because the actual government was requiring these sort of services. Now in Mexico, it has happened in a very different way. The Mexican government, the current Mexican government, is more oriented towards trying to get the two large utilities, the state-owned utilities, CFE, which is the electric utility, and Pemex, the oil utility, to become more relevant in their activities. And by doing this, they are affecting the evolution that we had in the past 10, 15 years, I would say. We're seeing increased price in electricity, which is somehow a positive thing to ESCOs because it enables the cash flow from energy savings to become bigger, and by that we can assess we can justify projects that maybe before were more difficult to approve. However, the policy is not very clear on energy savings. There is not, I would say that even with the current institutions like CONUE, SENACE, CRE, CENER, which are the bodies that regulate the energy market, I think they are lacking a policy that promotes energy efficiency, that provides maybe not only a fiscal incentive, but maybe some other sort of incentive that would generate value to the end user, and that would probably help ESCOs to develop faster. Now, listening to the presentations from everybody else in the panel, what I also realize is that Mexico needs to step up to energy efficiency in a much more proactive way. And I would say that there are definitely many companies that have been successful in getting energy efficiency developed internally. And what I was mentioning before, that the Mexican economy is so linked to the United States one, makes us a country that requires to become more efficient. And if you are aware, Mexico, Canada, and the United States signed a new free trade agreement in 2019. And this new free trade agreement is going to force Mexico to increase their labor tariffs. And therefore, we're not going to be a country with cheap labor anymore. It's going to be a much more costly labor. And by doing that, we have to take a look at energy efficiency, because we can offset that labor increase by improving energy efficiency. And that would definitely be of value to the companies working in the transformation, in the manufacturing, and in providing services to companies that sell to the United States, Canada, Europe, Japan, even China. Mexico is a country that has a very open economy. We are probably one of the countries with the most number of free trade agreements around the world. But we need to take advantage of it, because even though we have such an advantageous position, we are not making it work because we lack these policies. So from a market perspective, I think that the potential of Mexico might be maybe $2-3 billion a year of energy efficiency, but I don't think that we're getting there. I don't think that we're making more than maybe $500 million in energy efficiency projects, including distributed generation, which is another aspect of our geography that would pose a tremendous advantage. Mexico is a country that has a very, very high radiation, and we could produce a lot of energy from solar and wind power, and that would reduce even further our emissions, our CO2 emissions. So it's quite sad to see that we have all this potential and we are missing the opportunity. So we as the AMENER, the Mexican Energy Association, we work towards professionalizing the market, and we are trying to get more people knowledgeable in terms of monitoring and verification of savings, because we think that in the future that's going to create the balance between how equity, debt, and the projects interact together. I think we're close to finishing. So my final remark would be that it's a very interesting thing to see that across the world there are ESCOs growing fast. That gives me a lot of good and positive thinking. So I hope that that Mexico realizes what we need to do to get there, and hopefully detonate our ESCO market. I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for your insights. We're going to go now to, I'd love to ask you a few questions, but I'm going to resist because of time. I'm going to move now on to Alex. Alex, we don't have very much time and we're going to be eating into Q&A. But if you could have, I mean, you have a really interesting private sector view on all of this, having been part of that public sector conversation for many years. So tell us how it looks to you. Why can't we get more private sector money into the ESCO market? What's stopping that from happening?
Very, very good. Thank you, Mel. You see, the private sector working across 12 markets across Asia Pacific, and I'm very happy that I see over half of the Asia Pacific ESCO Industry Alliance in the audience today. It's now $23 billion or even more from the Asia Pacific ESCO industries contributing to annual investments. So it could be that 23 of the 33 global volume is actually generated out of Asia. So Asia Pacific has been a very strong test bed. Yes, we have a large share from China, but There's a lot of ESCO markets, Thailand, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, growing, and India also are growing with its 150 empaneled ESCOs. The point I'm trying to make is that there's still so much to be done. There's still so much to be done on the policy side. Now, in financial structures, I think, I speak as a former development banker with ADB and IFC. I think that we have overly relied on debt finance to flow capital through ESCOs. There's a temptation to think that the way that renewable energy, especially grid-tied renewable energy, is the same way that we should flow money through ESCOs. And I think that does it work? In my work over 12 developing Asian markets, I see that up to 98% of ESCOs do not have suitable access to debt finance from financial institutions. They may be able to borrow, that they typically max out their credit limit within, let's say, after 3 project loans, and they have to wait for their 10-year money to flow back. So it doesn't work. And I agree with Saurabh talking about ESL. What markets need, what private sector needs are equity flows outside the balance sheet of ESCOs and outside the balance sheet of end users. So it's a very innovative structures creating a demand for ESCO services, not only through ESCO direct procurements, but through innovative procurement modalities such as public-private partnership transactions, joint ventures with state-owned enterprises, large-scale government service providers, just like EESL. So you've got these large aggregators flowing equity and know-how. So, yes, debt finance is I think for the early years of growing the ESCO market, debt finance is good, but it could never be a a scale-up strategy in my mind. And we need more innovative equity channels, super ESCO, equity funds for ESCOs, ESCO guarantee funds alongside. Now, there's another barrier through most of Southeast Asia, for example. 8 out of 10 Southeast Asian economies still have energy prices subsidized, which is a large deterrent to private investments in energy efficiency and ESCO portfolios. Just we've got to accelerate the removal of energy subsidies in many of markets, not only Southeast Asia, but across the globe. And that would attract. We need more de-risking instruments. We need insurance products related to energy savings. We need new capital structures. We need even private super ESCOs. If governments cannot come to the plate, then they have private sector come up with super ESCO structures or equity channels that will flow equity and know-how and strengthen the ESCO sector. So I've got a long list of barrier removal solutions, but these are on top of my mind, how we can accelerate and scale up energy efficiency capital mobilization in energy efficiency. In Southeast Asia, I estimate that through 2040, we need to mobilize $892 billion in energy efficiency capital. And I'd like to think that at the 2/3 of that will have to flow outside the balance sheet of ESCOs and outside the balance sheet of end users. And that would be through innovative financial structures and procurement modalities.
Thank you, Alex. You've studied this business for a long time, and you've seen how China ESCOs grew and the sort of market that was developed there. You've seen the contrast of what's happened in India, which is, actually acted on a completely different sector of the market, both very, very strongly government-led. We heard from Paul about the less push from, or the lower level of push from government in the Mexican market. What would be your 3 top tips to a country that was starting out now with all of the knowledge we've developed over the last 30 years? But today, what are your top tips for a government who wants to try and stimulate an ESCO market?
First, you need a very strong law, a very comprehensive law that would create the system and create the market for ESCOs. Second is to create a demand from public sector. And this is very relevant to the post-COVID-19 economic recovery, and demonstrating that ESCO and energy efficiency investments are very effective job generator. So get governments to buy ESCO services early upfront. Accelerate a 10-year purchase or procurement program into, let's say, the next 3 years, and that would be a second. And of course, everyone has mentioned capacitate them. They're good technically, but they still need M&V capacities. They still need industry standard performance contracts in these markets. And I think something I think it might have been Barry. They're very good in the energy management and engineering portion, but very few ESCOs are very good in financial engineering. So they are unable to recapitalize themselves. So yes, create an environment for the private sector to come in, not only for private sector energy efficiency and ESCO contracts, but also public sector ESCO procurement. Allow private capital to come in a space that is often dominated by public funds.
Yeah, great advice. Great advice. We have a question from the audience about trust. And this has been one of the kind of dichotomies of the development of ESCOs. So ESCOs 101, 35 years ago or whatever it was, would say that the idea of ESCO, that companies were likely to invest in projects of kind of 1 to, if you're lucky, 3-year paybacks themselves, simple projects. And then the idea was that ESCOs would potentially pick up the 4 to 7 year type projects. That was the kind of early theory. Now, when we saw the ESCO market in China develop, that wasn't the case. So the companies picked up on the really, really short paybacks because of trust, because of financial security and those sorts of things. So so the questioner is asking, what's the top tip then for trying to find ways of creating that trust and allowing those longer payback period projects to be picked up by the ESCOs? What would you do? Paul, would you like to suggest what you think would help with trust?
Thanks, Mel. I guess that there are various aspects to your question, and I believe that ESCOs they have successful stories, and on the other hand, there are stories that are not as successful, and I think that if you compare it, and this is going to be somehow maybe strange, but if you compare a mortgage with an ESCO project, I mean, mortgage always has a security, the land, and it's very well understood. Whereas ESCO, the ESCO project, the performance contract, shared savings sort of a scheme, it's more difficult to assess by a banker or by an equity or capital investor because it's very technical. Okay, and in that technicality, not everybody is very proficient. So we need to train, we need to educate the different stakeholders, and I think that's at least in a country like Mexico, where educating the financial institutions, the legal service providers, the institutions. The investors, it's very it's in a very low stage. We need to invest more in education as well.
Interesting. I don't know if Lily's still with us. Are you still there, Lily?
Yes.
Yeah. So, well, has that, what I was talking about, that those very early projects, the really short payback ones, they were done in their thousands by ESCOs. Have the sort of longer term payback projects started to be funded more by ESCOs? And if that has happened,
Yeah.
how's that come about? Has there been an increase in trust?
Yes, trust really takes time. Yeah, according to the experience in China, you know, at the very beginning, it's really very hard for the bankers, you know, to trust the small, medium-sized ESCOs. So the World Bank project provide a guarantee fund for the new and the small ESCOs, so that the new and small ESCOs can, you know, set up a kind of relations or contacts with the banks at the very beginning. As long as they can get the first loan from the bank, the trust they start to work together, and probably for several projects afterwards, they can build up this kind of trust between the ESCOs and the banks. But you know, the banks always love the rich people, not the ESCOs with you know, lots of investment on the projects with future return. So some business models has been created, new business models like what we call entrustment of energy management systems, which contract terms may be 10 to 20 years for some of the contracts. I think the banks has already, as long as the banks can realize that the project is profitable, even for a longer term, they can introduce a third party like a leasing company or guarantee company, you know, to share the risk, or to share risk with the banks and to guarantee the risk for the ESCOs. It's really not easy, but there are some ways we can overcome. As long as we're still working on it. We can either, you know, develop a new business models, or we can introduce a third party. So yeah, in China, some other ESCOs, they can have a longer term for 20 years.
Okay, but as you say, you know, you spent 25 years investing in that in the market, so it's not a new market anymore, and there's a level of confidence that's built over that period of time. So very interesting. So one of the things that we believe, of course, is that with the advent of cheap sensors and cheap and effective telecommunications technologies, we can simplify monitoring and verification so that we can, of course, Sarab's position was that we should have simple projects, and the deemed and demonstrated was a fantastic method that worked really well for India. But there are still lots of places where they want more of a verification protocol, as Alex has mentioned. So do we see digitalization as making a big change here? Can we see a future ESCO market where the savings can be more proven in that specific example? What do you think about that, Lily? Is that happening in China yet?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I want to talk about, the current situation of ESCOs in China. You know, at the very beginning, probably the shared saving models is quite popular and dominant the market, and even the government policies are supporting this kind of business models. But as the market gets mature and the ESCOs get mature, so the new business models start with the new technologies. I think digitalization is really a very useful and helpful tool to control the risk, or to reduce the risk for the bankers. And as you know, that the Chinese ESCO market is getting from the simple solutions to more integrated solutions for the customers. So new technologies, especially IT technologies and the digitalization systems were introduced. Some of the I can say lots of ESCOs are using digitalization of the energy management systems, not only to increase the energy efficiency, but to provide more confidence and more confident, yeah, actually for the investors, which means that you can see the project investment and the process of the energy efficiency improvement, and you can evaluate or or calculate the savings automatically, and nobody it will be quite hard to cheat. You know,
Okay.
if there is less cheat, then that will be more trust.
More
So
trust in the bigger market.
So I believe digitalization will be quite helpful to increase the trust, especially to increase the confidence of the investors. So right now, more and more the bankers really working on it with the ESCOs.
Brilliant. We're going to have to stop now because we've run out of time, but I think that's a great note to end on. Increasing investor confidence with better evidence that digitalization brings to us, and that hopefully this can help us make a kind of paradigm shift in the ESCO markets because that confidence increased. I'm sorry that we've run out of time because it's a very interesting conversation, but I'd just like to thank all of our speakers, all of our contributors, thank Ashok for helping us put this together and for being willing to work with us on this. And let's hope this is just the start of a conversation. If people online want to send us ideas about elements of ESCOs that they'd like to talk about in the future, or other elements of financing, just do let us know because we're very keen to continue a series of conversations about this. So thank you everybody for your time, and I look forward to the next installment of this discussion. Bye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.